Morning, guys. How are we doing today? Today we're going to jump right into the music. Wife seems to be back on her feet. One of my kids ain't feeling the best right now, but hopefully it's just the flu. My wife did end up testing negative. Today I want to talk about the SAVOY record label. And it's a label that collectors know. And the SAVOY Ballroom, of course, which isn't linked to it, is a pretty famous jazz term. You're going to hear that name pop up a lot. The SAVOY Ballroom was an important part of the Harlem jazz culture throughout the 20s, 30s, 40s, into the 50s, maybe even in the early 60s, I believe. It was there a long time. And from the days of Dixieland bands and Chick Webb to the Jitterbug to Lindy Hoppers, it was there for a long time doing its thing. But the SAVOY label was out of New Jersey, out of Newark. I've talked about it numerous times before. It was founded by a fellow by the name of Herman Lubinsky, a giant of a Jew, big fella, a very poor reputation for how he treated his black musicians, indentured servants, let's say. But that being said, he is still a very important part of the jazz history books, in part because he recorded so many of the great black musicians. And he might not have seen them as anything more than cattle, in a way, but he still recognizes that they were doing something important. And so what I want to do here is I want to show you my 12 favorite obvious SAVOY records from the 12,000 series. And then I want to show you a dozen less obvious favorites from the SAVOY catalog. And then depending on how it goes, I might do a dozen SAVOYs that most people have never seen. Although I feel like I've shown you guys some of those rare SAVOYs in different settings. The white musicians in jazz, I showed you a lot of those old SAVOYs. But we'll see what people's responses are to these episodes. We're going to do these two for sure. So we're going to start with the great, the immortal Byrd, Charlie Parker. This is number 12,001. And a lot of SAVOY's early 12-inch material is Parker stuff from the 40s. And I've told you this before, but for those who are new to the channel or have forgotten, a lot of SAVOY's output in the 12,000 series in 1955 and 56 is reissuing 10-inch stuff from the 50s and 78 RPM era stuff from the 40s onto this new format, the LP. And of course, SAVOY is one of the preeminent labels in the post-war years. And we should not forget that. In spite of Lubinsky's reputation, and there was other people a part of the label. I believe the guy who ended up at Roost was a key instrumental part of early SAVOY sessions as well. His name is escaping me right now. But there were some pretty big names at SAVOY that matriculate down through the next decades as pretty important jazz figures. Lubinsky is one of the first guys to get Parker into the studios post-war. And that's a very important thing. Bebop's happening in Harlem during the war, during the recording ban, and Parker can just set a stage on fire. A very ghost-like figure is Charles Parker. There's a strange humility and insecurity coupled with a great braveness and a sense of purpose. And definitely had a bad drug habit, an alcohol habit, a problem with women. If he was your brother, you'd be worried about him a lot. Let's just say that. But he and Dizzy kind of codify what bebop's going to be. That might even be a young Miles Davis right there, who was on some of these takes. I think he might be on these right here. Tommy Potter, Duke Jordan, Max Roach is on the drums. This is jazz becoming its modern self. And so these are very important recordings from a very important moment in jazz's history. And they're actually fairly good sounding for the time frame and a lot of what Parker's discography sounds like. So much of it is a live thing someone recorded on a boot cassette in their shoe and doesn't sound good. There's stuff where people turned off the recordings when Parker was done playing and didn't care about the rest of the band. These are fairly full alternate takes. It's a great period in Parker's development and the development of the music. And they're just the names on this record. It's kind of a who's who of the early bebop era. Guys like Tiny Grimes, Tommy Potter, Max Roach, Bud Powell, Duke Jordan. It's important people. And again, there's a lot of Parker in the early 12,000, really up into the 12,150s. They're still putting out Parker stuff from the vaults. So he was a very important piece of the Savoy Empire. And thank goodness for that. Second record I want to show you, also it's also vintage vault stuff, and that's the great Coleman Hawkins. And Hawkins reinvents, well, not reinvents, he puts the saxophone on the map for all intents and purposes. He was a huge influence on just about everybody, from contemporaries like Ben Webster and Lester Young to Dexter Gordon and John Coltrane, Sonny Rollins. Everybody who was anything in this music was influenced by Coleman Hawkins on the tenor saxophone. And a little trick about Savoy is when you're record hunting, a black and white cover like that, it's always going to be the old pressings. And a lot of these Savoy records have alternate covers. They gave them color, different covers, often in the 60s, that can make you buy the same record twice. I'm trying to see if they list the band on this. I don't see it listed here, sadly. They're not great at that kind of stuff, honestly. But I remember looking it up before, and I think it's from 1948 or 49, something like that. That beautiful tone is already present. You know, he's just a really gorgeous storyteller and puts the saxophone in the hierarchy of jazz where it remained throughout all the advancements in the music. The saxophone only became more preeminent starting here. By the 60s, in the hard bop into the avant-garde, trumpet players are disappearing. The trombone is off the charts, no longer around. It becomes saxophone, saxophone, saxophone. Everybody wanted to overblow and honk that thing. But this is the man that kind of is what the legacy is really built on. And it's a record, if you stumble on this in a record store, you'll probably, in the wild, be 40, 50 bucks. It's definitely worth having. It's outstanding stuff. Nice heavy pressing of this. That's Cafe Bohemia After Dark. And this is an incredible record. It represents one of the first times Savoy in 55 is tracking new material. It's number 1217. And most of what comes before this is Errol Garner, Fats Navarro, Dizzy Gillespie, Charlie Parker, all stuff from the vaults. This is actually from this moment, and boy, what a moment this is. Kenny Clark, who kind of gets the leadership here, probably due to his experience as being the biggest name. Horace Silver's on the piano, who goes on to incredible fame at Blue Note. Nat Adderley is on the cornet, along with his brother Cannonball Adderley. And this is the first really appearances of the Adderley brothers. They came up from Florida. They get on these sessions. The great young Donald Byrd. This is before his first album has come out, before he's at Blue Note. It's probably right about the time he's about to play with the Messengers, actually. Paul Chambers is on the bass, and then Jerome Richardson's on tenor and flute. And Jerome Richardson has a few LPs that are really tough to find. A fantastic player that kind of predates Dolphy a little bit. He's not as avant-garde as Dolphy, but he certainly has a lot of creativity and plays the flute and the saxophone like Dolphy, and is a very interesting player. And I'm a big fan of Jerome Richardson's stuff, but this is this has numerous different covers, and it's one of the things that makes collecting Savoy very tricky. And there's Donald Byrd. It's just a great documentation of an early moment in the progression of hard bop. That's what this is. Clifford Brown and Max Butcher are already kind of setting the table over at Emerson in Chicago. This is a great example of hard bop's development and moving away from just simple bebop, where it's churning out mathematics and numbers and abandoning melody, and there's a lot of feeling and a lot of groove going on here once again. And this record, especially with this cover, is hard to find. And it's one of my favorite records. It's a beautiful moment in the jazz lexicon. Number 1232 is Donald Byrd's first record as a leader. Another record that's very tough to come by. Another record that's become quite expensive. It's tough to find this for under $100. It's pretty tough. Japanese reissues of this can fetch $80, $120. It's a tough record to churn down and find out. But again, this predates his moving to Blue Note. It's probably synonymous with his moment with Horace Silver and the Jazz Messengers. This has the great Hank Jones on the piano, Paul Chambers on the bass, Kenny Clark is on the drums, and the fantastic Frank Foster, who played with Basie quite a long time, is on the tenor saxophone. It's one of those records, if you find it, don't pass it up. You know, if they're asking 150, ask them if you can give them 100 cash. See what they'll say. In a record store environment, you'll have a good shot at pulling this in for under $100. It's a fantastic chapter, and I don't think this one got another cover, oddly enough. For one of its preeminent titles, you would think it would have gotten the updated covers like a lot of the other records did, but I don't think I've ever seen a different cover to that one. Number 1253 is a record by the great Hank Jones. And Hank Jones is one of the great unappreciated piano players in the music. And he shows up on endless sessions as a sideman, but his titles as a leader kind of go under the radar. And he makes 4 or 5 records actually as a leader at Savoy in 55, 56, 57, and they almost all feature, if not all of them, Kenny Clark and Wendell Marshall on the bass and drums. That trio was a firmly established house band, if you will, for Savoy. And there's a lot of records on Savoy's discography that the fact that those 3 are laying down the rhythm makes that record worth having. And there's a lot of records where they show up as the rhythm section. Kenny Clark especially is on a lot of Savoy stuff in the late 50s. But Wendell Marshall, the fabulous young bass player, there's Hank and there's Kenny. These three have a real ear for each other. And as I've said before, listening is part of a conversation. Just a bunch of people talking over each other, that's not a conversation, that's chaos. And a great trio, it's key to have listening happening all the time, to be very in tune. And boy, Hank Jones's minimalism, it's just a breath of fresh air in a very hectic world. If you don't learn to love Hank Jones, we're not listening to the same music. And then in this session, as with a couple of the other ones of these trio sessions, they do have guests appear. And I think that's actually Donald Byrd right there. Byrd does make a flurry of stuff. Ernie Wilkins, the top brass, he's on that. Yeah, Herbie Mann's on this as well. Joe Wilder. That actually might be Joe Wilder right there. Wilder's a bit more veteran, a little bit more melodic, a little sweeter tone-wise. Matty Dice is on the trumpet as well, who, that's a nom de plume for Thad Jones, Hank Jones' brother. And then Jerome Richardson as well is on this, and Eddie Jones is on the bass on a track or two. But yeah, it's mostly that great trio. And just the sidemen, the trio itself, it's the stuff of legends. And by now we're 12:053, and we're firmly, this is from this moment. This isn't reissued stuff. And so you can hear where jazz is in 1955, and this is right there on the cutting edge of what's happening at Blue Note, what's happening at Prestige, all the modernity of post-bebop is happening right here with these guys. And it leads to Savoy having some real hidden gems in the mid-12,000 sequence that a lot of collectors ignore or don't know about. And but that's just because so many people don't know Hank Jones. And I gotta admit, a couple years ago I didn't know much about Hank Jones. It was in filling out these labeled discographies where a lot of the stuff started to become more prevalent to me, and I started to realize the significance of a guy. If you've tracked 100 records as a side guy, you're an important part of jazz. We've seen how Donald Byrd had become a real important part of Savoy's stable in 1955-56. And at the same time, he is working with Silver and the Jazz Messengers, and young Donald Byrd is setting his path. And in 58, I believe, he signs with Blue Note, and then, as you can say, the rest is history. He makes a lot of the great records of the jazz canon at that point. But Byrd is the first of three Blue Note legends that Savoy houses, and this is with his buddy Hank Mobley. And him and Hank will make records together at Blue Note in the late 50s and early 60s. And Horace Silver, Doug Watkins, John LaPorta, Roddy Ball, Wendell Marshall, and Kenny Clark are all on this session. Roddy Ball's on the piano, that's interesting. John LaPorta, Doug Watkins. If you recall, when the Messengers split up in 56, Silver, Watkins, and Mobley all head out and do Silver's group for a while. So there's this real convoluted moment where what's happening at Blue Note, what's happening at Savoy is very interwoven, and a lot of it's being recorded at Van Gelder's studio in New Jersey. This is Ozzy Cadena and Rudy Van Gelder, and it's just a great session. 12:064. You can see Mobley's face there. It shows you the ascendancy of Savoy in this moment. They're on the cutting edge. They're doing some very important things. They don't have the body of work that Blue Note or Prestige has. You know, the number of titles that comes out, they're really a 40s, early 50s focused label from a historical standpoint. When you look at Savoy's body of work, their really important stuff is 46 through 56. That's where they really were making, cutting their teeth. And this is at the end of that era, and their recordings start to diminish, and they don't really keep the young, great talent very long. Guys shuffle off and move along. And how much of that was just working for Herman Lubinsky, that's an interesting question. Because I've certainly read quotes where a number of these guys didn't love working in that environment. And I believe it even got to a point where they had to kick Lubinsky out of recording sessions. And I think I might be confusing that with Bob Weinstock at Prestige, but I think it was Lubinsky. I'm almost positive it was Lubinsky, where they just said, you can't even be here because you create tension, you create agitation in an unhealthy way, and you make these guys tense up. And so they left in the hands of Ozzy Cadena and Van Gelder and left him to run the books and do what he needed to do back in Newark, as you watched the Jews and the Italians being kind of forced out of Newark as the city started into an incredible downward spiral. People talk a lot about Detroit, and Detroit certainly fell on some hard times, but Newark was really one of the first places that the manufacturing jobs left the New York area, and when they did, New York reinvented itself, but Newark really didn't find that new industry, and Newark really descended into some abject poverty and really run down neighborhoods. And I guess that's starting to make a comeback the last 15 years or so as Jersey City, and that kind of forces its way south towards Newark. But remember, Newark's not far from New York City. It's on the New Jersey side, a little south of Staten Island, so it's pretty much right there. But this is Kluk's Clique, and Kluk was nicknamed for the great Kenny Clark. And Kenny Clark, as you see, was on the Bohemia records with the Hank Jones stuff. He was on the Mobley stuff. This is actually John Laporta on the cover, which is interesting. But Kluk was his nickname, and I'm not really sure how he got that, I don't recall, but something to do with his name, Kenny Clark, Kluk. But Kluk's Clique is a great little session, very much in the hard bop tradition. This would match a lot of what's going on at Blue Note in the late 1500s series. Kenny Clark, John Laporta, Donald Byrd, Ronnie Ball, and Wendell Marshall. And so you have quite an awesome group there with Ball, Wendell Marshall, and Kenny Clark, with Port and Byrd. There's Byrd right there. Byrd's always got that kind of slightly rusty sound, but again, a great record and just a great golden era for jazz at Savoy, and it's going to come to an end fairly quickly. The one record in this series I don't have an original of is obviously a Japanese pressing, is Introducing Lee Morgan with Hank Mobley's Quintet. And this is also 1956. And Morgan makes the third of the three legends of Blue Note that really kind of got off the ground at Savoy. And from everything I've read, going to Blue Note after working for Lubinsky was a breath of fresh air. Like I said, Lubinsky was just a tension monger, and Alfred Lyon and Frank Wolf were excited to have you guys there, honored to be a part of what you guys are doing instead of tolerating somebody. It's very different. This is with Hank Jones, Hank Mobley, Doug Watkins, and Art Taylor, which that's an incredible group. It's amazing how small the jazz world is in some ways in 1955-56. And we forget, too, that a lot of these names seem fairly common to the jazz fan today. But a lot of these guys were pretty unknown at the time, and they were just making money, doing work, doing what they could, put their name out there. Morgan gets this record, number 12091, and it springboards him to a great career. He goes to Blue Note, makes 6 great records in the late 50s there, goes to VJ for a couple, comes back to Blue Note, does Sidewinder, and has a whole nother career at Blue Note in the 60s. But his 50s sound is much different. It's much more intense, full of vitriol, full of lava. Mobley still got that creamy essence, and the contrast between the creamy fluidity of Hank Mobley and the kind of acerbic citric acid of Lee Morgan. It's always an interesting concoction. Again, a tough record to find. I believe Dizzy Gillespie gave him that bent horn trumpet, which he played quite a lot for a long time. I think Gillespie gave it to him, if I recall. I could be getting my stories mixed up, but if memory serves, I'll leave it at that. If memory serves, because sometimes memory can be really wrong. But I find more often than not, when I watch an episode afterwards and go, oh, am I right on that? I find I'm right about 9% of the time. Once in a while I'll be like, oh, I was wrong on that. No, I'll try to correct that. But this is number 12092, the very next release, Jazz Message number 2. And these are not to be confused with Mobley's Message 1 and 2 at Prestige. Mobley's Message 1, these Jazz Message 1 and 2 at SAVOY are different records with different artists and different songs. There's not just a reissue or repackaging at Prestige, which I remember hoping at one point it was, so I didn't have to buy them. But this is the second kind of loose, young kids in the hard bop scene session that they just call Jazz Message number 1 and number 2. They've both kind of been attributed to Hank Mobley at this point. But Mobley, Morgan, Byrd, all three of those Blue Note giants, Hank Jones, Barry Harris on the piano on a couple tracks, Doug Watkins, Kenny Clark, and Howard Taylor take turns on the drums. And my guess is these guys have already all moved on from SAVOY at this point. It's not probably a session where they sat down and said, let's record this Hank number 2, but they had some stuff left over, and that's why you have two different drummers, two different piano players. They called these stuff together because these guys were already going to Blue Note and starting to make an impact there, and so they wanted to cash in on these guys ascending fame. And that being said, it's a great session. You know, it's a great set of tracks, a great group, and it's a clear-cut example of SAVOY being in the right place at the right time. So, a record I've shown again a couple times before, and some of these obvious choices here I've shown before, but that's why they're the obvious choices. They're kind of the real staples of the SAVOY canon in this moment in time. This is Yusef Lateef, one of the Detroit alumni, along with the Flanagans and Chambers and Donald Byrds, the Jones brothers. Detroit was really putting out an incredible body of musicians, but it was one of the great centers of black population. You know, the Great Migration, Detroit was one of the first places blacks, families looking for work went. The auto industry was there, and if you were a black victim of what's the word I'm looking for? The share farmers, what are they called down the south? It was pretty much slavery. It wasn't any better. So to go north with the hope of getting a work at Chrysler, Pontiac, GM, Ford, that was the hope. And that was a living wage that was sustainable. And it actually creates a climate where Detroit has some black colleges and universities, and it became an upwardly mobile part of the black community. But it also creates this wealth of jazz musicians that Yusef Lateef's a big part of. Here's with Wilbur Hardin on the trumpet, Hugh Lawson, Ernie Farrow, and Oliver Jackson on the drums. And Jackson's a great drummer, by the way. I think he's also Detroit. But it's the foray of Yusef Lateef into world sound. He's already converted to Muslim. I believe his name initially, I don't want to get this wrong, I think it was Bill Evans. I might be thinking of another guy, but he obviously that was his Muslim adopted name, and he really adopts Eastern sounds. Prayer to the East is the name of it. He adopts all kinds of world African sounds and instruments. This is a great record, and another, again, almost all these records I'm showing you, you're gonna have a tough time finding any of them for under $100. That's just where these records live in their price range. Tanganyika Strut by Wilbur Hardin. This record comes out probably 1958, and it's really important because it's got one young John Coltrane on it. And young Coltrane was in his development phase here. And it's right around the time where he's done Blue Train. He's probably on the cusp of working with Miles. This got reissued numerous different ways over the years. People licensed it from Savoy, so you can find this in numerous different ways. This is actually not a first pressing, it's the second pressing. It's got Tommy Flanagan, Curtis Fuller, Coltrane Hardin, Howard Williams, Allie Jackson, and Art Taylor. It's beautiful right there. Sounds like Curtis Fuller. This is the title track, Tanganyika Strut, and it's just the whole side is a groove, and these guys are just laying it down. Cool cover. You can tell it's kind of towards the end of the Savoy run. Definitely feels different than the earlier covers that Savoy was doing, and this record's become very expensive, obviously, because Coltrane's on it. And you're hearing Coltrane's development here as he's going through his sheets of sound developments at Prestige and starting to figure out the modal thing with Miles. It's a record that I think it's on Dial Africa. I think it's also the same session. So there's, like I said, there's numerous different titles that encompass these recordings that you can find. But I'd like to find an old Savoy that eventually, but there's only so much time and money in this world. And the last record I want to show you today is the fantastic Curtis Fuller Bluesette. And Fuller actually makes 3 records for Savoy in 1959, 60, and they're all great sessions. This is around the same time he's working with Art Farmer and Benny Golson. This actually has Benny Golson on it, Flanagan, Jimmy Garrison, and Al Harewood. So they're really setting a Jimmy Garrison here, who of course ends up with the great Coltrane Quartet in the 60s. Ozzy Cadena, Rudy Van Gelder again behind this. It's a great recording, very modern. Fuller's Savoy stuff will fit in really well with Fuller's Blue Note recordings. And Fuller's a great player, probably the second best bebop, hard bop trombone player behind the great J.J. Johnson, and of course on par with Jimmy Cleveland, who's a guy who didn't get a lot of recordings as a leader, but is just a fantastic trombone. Fuller's really a dynamic player. He plays very dexterous and with a lot of enunciation, which some trombone players tend to slur and bend, and the notes become blurred because of that sliding motion. He has a lot of clear enunciation, which of course J.J. Johnson and Jimmy Cleveland both do that as well. And no one's probably better at it than Jimmy Cleveland. Boy, he's almost like Clifford Brown on the trombone. But as a leader, Fuller's body of work is the most important of the 3. J.J. Johnson's kind of a victim of the labels he was at, and he ends up making some fairly commercial stuff at Columbia that's easy to find for $5-10. And you can always appreciate the playing of J.J. Johnson, whether it's with Kai Winding or on his own. He's a fantastic player, but it's not the aggression and honesty of the young black males that a guy like Curtis Fuller records at Blue Note and at Savoy. These are poignant records, full of edge, full of velocity, full of discontent, and interesting covers as well. Again, the later Savoy stuff starts looking dramatically different from the 50s stuff. So that's my favorite dozen obvious Savoy records. And in the next episode, we're going to look at 12 Savoy records that are a little less obvious, that I also love. And we'll see how people respond to these 2 episodes. I certainly think there's room to do this for a lot of labels. again, we'll see how the response is and if people want to watch it. So y'all be safe. Y'all have a good day. Stay inside, stay warm. Go outside, exercise, just be smart. We got to get through these next few months so things can get better for all of us on this planet. Blessings to everybody. We'll talk to you soon. Peace.